I'm Eric, 32 male. I live in a small but comfortable apartment in the city working as a freelance graphic designer. For most of my life, I believed my family, my mom Helen, my dad Mark, and my younger brother Kyle, was my safety net. It turns out that net was woven with lies, and it was designed to catch only one of us when he fell. This is the story of how I discovered that the money meant to secure my future was stolen to save my brother from his own mistakes, and how I took back control, not just of my finances, but of my entire life. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. In every family, there seems to be an unspoken casting of roles. You don't audition, you're just assigned a part and you're expected to play it for life. In my family, the roles were crystal clear from the beginning. My younger brother Kyle was the golden child. I was the responsible one. It wasn't something my parents Helen and Mark ever said out loud, but their actions spoke with a clarity that words could never match. Kyle, only 2 years my junior, could do no wrong. Or rather, he could do plenty of wrong, but it was never his fault. If he failed a test, the teacher was biased. If he got into a fight, the other kid provoked him. If he crashed his first car, a brand new sedan they bought him for his 18th birthday, the roads were slippery. I, on the other hand, was held to a different standard. If my grades slipped from an A to a B+, my parents would ask if I was losing focus. When I worked 2 part-time jobs in high school to save up for my own used car, my dad would comment on how building character was important. I never resented it, not really. I understood that Kyle was just different. He had a charisma that I lacked, a way of making people feel good even when he was letting them down. I was quiet, methodical, and dependable. I was the one who remembered birthdays, fixed my mom's computer, and helped my dad with his taxes. Kyle was the one who showed up late to family dinners with a charming smile and a wild story, and all would be forgiven. This dynamic continued into adulthood. I went to a state college, got a practical degree in graphic design, and started my career. I paid my own rent, managed my own budget, and slowly built a life for myself. Kyle, meanwhile, bounced from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. He called himself an entrepreneur. First, it was dropshipping cheap electronics. Then it was day trading crypto with money he'd borrowed from our parents. His latest venture was flipping used cars, which mostly involved him buying lemons and spending weeks trying to offload them at a loss. Through it all, our parents were his biggest cheerleaders, and I would later learn his primary investors. Kyle just has so much ambition, my mom would say, a proud glint in her eye. He just needs one of his ideas to take off. My own ambitions were quieter. I enjoyed my work. I found satisfaction in creating a clean logo for a small business or designing a website that was both beautiful and functional. I wasn't trying to become a millionaire overnight, I just wanted stability. The source of my future stability, or so I was told, was a trust fund set up by my grandparents. They had been frugal, hardworking people who invested wisely. When they passed away, they left a significant amount of money to be split between Kyle and me. According to my parents, who were the trustees, the funds were to be managed by them until we each turned 35. It was, they said, my grandparents' wish that we be mature and settled before getting access to it. It made sense to me. I was good with money, but a lump sum like that could be tempting. For Kyle, it would be like giving a toddler a loaded weapon. I trusted my parents completely. I saw the annual statements they occasionally showed me, saw the numbers grow steadily, and felt secure. It was my safety net, a foundation for a future house, maybe a family of my own someday. The first major crack in this family portrait appeared with Kyle's first DUI. He was 25, wrapped his car around a telephone pole, and was lucky to walk away with just scratches. My parents were frantic. They hired him a lawyer, paid his fines, and bought him a replacement car within a month. The narrative was that he'd made a silly mistake after a bad day. The second DUI came 2 years later. This time there was a minor accident involved, another car with a dented bumper. The consequences were more severe: a suspended license, mandatory classes, and hefty fines. Again, my parents swooped in. They portrayed him as a victim of circumstance. He was just so stressed about his business, my mom explained to me over the phone, her voice laced with worry. He knows he messed up. He's learned his lesson this time. I offered to talk to Kyle, to maybe help him find a more stable job, but my mom waved it off. Don't pressure him, Eric. He's under enough stress. I tried to be understanding. Kyle was my brother, and despite our differences, I loved him. But I was starting to see a pattern that made me deeply uncomfortable. He never faced any real consequences for his actions because my parents always built a financial wall around him to absorb the impact. His mistakes were expensive, not just in dollars, but in the emotional energy the whole family poured into managing his crises. Meanwhile, I was expected to be self-sufficient, to never be a burden, and for the most part I was. I rarely asked for anything. I handled my own problems, paid my own bills, and prided myself on my independence. I thought this was what it meant to be a good son, a responsible adult. I had no idea that my responsibility was seen not as a strength to be proud of, but as a resource to be exploited. The family roles had been set in stone, and the foundation of my life was about to be rocked by the biggest crisis of all, one that was mine, and one they would refuse to acknowledge. Life has a funny way of testing your foundations when you least expect it. For me, that test came not in the form of a sudden, dramatic event, but as a slow, creeping illness that started with fatigue and ended with a diagnosis that turned my world upside down. At 32, I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was chronic, debilitating, and expensive to manage. The specialist I needed to see wasn't fully covered by my freelance insurance plan, and the cocktail of medications required to keep the symptoms at bay came with a staggering monthly price tag. Suddenly, the stable life I had so carefully constructed felt like it was built on sand. The medical bills started piling up, each envelope a fresh wave of anxiety. I drained my savings account, then my emergency fund. I started taking on extra projects, working late into the night until my vision blurred and my hands ached, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. The stress was immense. The physical symptoms of my illness were exacerbated by the constant worry about money. I lost weight, I couldn't sleep. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly overwhelmed, and for the first time, I knew I had to ask for help. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. My entire identity was built around being the responsible one, the one who never needed anything. Asking my parents for money felt like an admission of failure. But I was desperate. I calculated the bare minimum I would need to cover the specialist's upcoming treatment plan and the next 6 months of medication, about $15,000. It was a lot of money, but I knew my parents had savings and I figured they could lend it to me. I would pay them back, of course, with interest. I just needed a bridge to get me through the worst of it. I called my mom, my heart pounding in my chest. I explained the situation calmly, laying out the diagnosis, the treatment plan, and the costs. I emphasized that it was a loan, that I had a payment plan in mind, and that I wouldn't have asked if it wasn't an absolute emergency. The line was silent for a long moment. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was strained, distant. "Oh, Eric, that sounds awful. We had no idea it was that serious." I felt a brief flicker of relief. She understood. But then came the pivot. $15,000, honey, that's just, we can't. We're completely broke. Broke, my parents lived comfortably. My dad managed a successful hardware store, they owned their house outright, and they had always been careful with money. The word didn't compute. "What do you mean you're broke?" I asked, confusion creeping into my voice. "Things have just been tight," she said vaguely. "Your father's hours have been cut back a bit, and with the cost of everything going up, we just don't have that kind of money sitting around. We're barely making ends meet ourselves." Her words felt hollow, rehearsed. I pressed gently at first. "Mom, I'm not asking for a gift. It's a loan. I can sign a formal agreement." "It's not about that, Eric," she said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "The money isn't there. We can't give you what we don't have. We're so sorry. Maybe you can look into some of those online fundraising things." I felt a cold dread wash over me. An online fundraiser. She was suggesting I beg for money from strangers because my own family couldn't help me. The conversation ended soon after, with my mom offering empty platitudes and promises to pray for me. I hung up the phone feeling smaller and more alone than I ever had in my life. I had been vulnerable, I had asked for help, and I had been turned away with an excuse that felt like a lie. 2 days later, the real betrayal landed. My phone rang. It was Kyle, his VO. Ice was a frantic whisper. "Eric, I'm in deep trouble. I need you to tell Mom and Dad you're okay, that your health stuff isn't a big deal." "What are you talking about, Kyle?" I asked, my head spinning. "I got another DUI," he blurted out. "It's my third one. The lawyer said I could be facing actual jail time. Mom and Dad are freaking out. They're pooling everything to hire this top lawyer, a real shark. But your call about your medical bills, Mom's worried it looks bad, so just downplay it for me, okay? Tell them you've got it figured out." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They weren't broke. They were broke for me. All their resources, their focus, their barely making ends meet savings were being funneled directly to Kyle's latest, most catastrophic mistake. They didn't have $15,000 to help their responsible son manage a chronic illness, but they had an astronomical sum to hire a shark for the golden child who couldn't stop breaking the law. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. My genuine, unavoidable health crisis was an inconvenience to be managed, an obstacle to the more important task of saving Kyle from himself yet again. My pain was secondary, my needs were irrelevant. I felt a surge of anger so pure and cold it almost took my breath away. "No, Kyle," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I won't downplay it, and don't call me again." I ended the call before he could respond. The wall of silence from my parents in the following days was confirmation enough. They didn't call to check on me. They didn't ask if I was okay. They were too busy circling the wagons around Kale, leaving me outside in the cold. The responsible one had finally become a burden, and they had rejected me without a second thought. I was truly on my own. Little did I know, the truth was far worse than a simple case of parental favoritism. I was not just being ignored, I was being robbed. The weeks that followed were a blur of anger, hurt, and a grim, grinding determination. I felt like I had been cast out. My family, the very people who were supposed to be my anchor, had cut the rope and let me drift. I stopped calling them. They didn't call me. The silence was a gaping wound. I threw myself into my work, taking on any project I could find, pushing my body and mind to their limits. I was running on fumes, driven by a spiteful need to prove that I didn't need them. I managed to scrape together enough money to pay for my most critical medication for the next month, but my specialist's appointments were postponed indefinitely. Every day was a struggle, a battle against my own body and the crushing weight of my family's abandonment. The mail became a source of dread. I expected more bills, more final notices. But one afternoon, tucked in with the usual junk mail and medical invoices, was a thick cream-colored envelope with the return address of a prestigious-looking law firm, Blackwood, Finch and Associates. I didn't recognize the name. I assumed it was some kind of advertisement, but the envelope was addressed to my father, Mark, at my address. It was a simple mistake. Our names were similar enough, and I had lived at home briefly after college. Mail mix-ups happened occasionally. My first instinct was to just forward it to him, to write "not at this address" on the front and drop it back in the mailbox. But something made me pause. Blackwood, Finch and Associates, it sounded expensive. It sounded like the kind of firm you hire when you're in serious trouble. It sounded like the kind of firm you de-hire for a third offense DUI. Curiosity, tinged with a dark suspicion, got the better of me. It was addressed to my father but sent to my home. My hands trembled slightly as I slit the envelope open. I told myself I was just checking to see what it was, to make sure it wasn't something urgent, but I knew deep down I was looking for something else. I was looking for confirmation of the betrayal I already felt in my bones. Inside was a single folded document. It wasn't a letter, it was an invoice. And at the top, the client's name was listed as Mark and Helen on behalf of their son, Kyle. My breath caught in my throat. I was right. This was Kyle's high-priced legal defense. I scanned the page, my eyes taking in the details with a sickening sense of dread. There were charges for consultations, legal research, filing motions. The numbers were astronomical. The initial retainer alone was $50,000. $50,000. They had told me they were broke, that they couldn't possibly lend me $15,000, a third of that amount, to keep me healthy. My anger was a hot, choking thing, but as my eyes continued down the page, my anger turned to ice. At the bottom of the invoice was a section detailing the payment received. It read, "Paid in full $50,000, payment received via wire transfer." And then, right below it, was a line that made the entire world stop. Source of funds, EM Generational Trust Act hash, EM Eric, my initials. The account number was familiar. I had seen it on the statements my parents had shown me over the years. It was my trust fund, my grandparents' legacy, my safety net. The money they had told me was untouchable until I was 35. They hadn't just pooled their money. They hadn't just sacrificed their own savings for Kyle. They had taken mine. They had stolen from my future to pay for his crimes. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. I sank into a chair, the invoice shaking in my hand. It was a level of deceit I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Every conversation, every excuse replayed in my mind, now cast in a sinister new light. My mom's strained voice on the phone, her talk of being broke. It wasn't a lie to spare my feelings, it was a lie to cover up a theft. Kyle's frantic call asking me to downplay my illness. He wasn't just asking for a favor, he was an active participant in the fraud, trying to manage me so I wouldn't look too closely at the family finances. They hadn't just chosen him over me. They had actively sacrificed my well-being and my financial security for his. I felt a profound sense of violation. It was as if they had reached into my chest and taken something vital, something I didn't even know was vulnerable. My trust in them, the bedrock of my entire life, was shattered. In its place was a cold, hard certainty. I had been a fool. The responsible one wasn't a roll of honor. It was the role of the Mark, the one they knew they could count on to not cause trouble, to not ask questions, to just keep his head down while they bled him dry. That single piece of paper delivered to the wrong address had changed everything. The betrayal was no longer just a feeling, it was a fact printed in black and white. And I knew, sitting there in my quiet apartment with the evidence in my hand, that I could not let this stand. For a full day, I did nothing. I sat with the invoice, the damning piece of paper, on my coffee table. I'd pick it up, read it again, and put it down. The initial shock gave way to a series of roiling emotions, white-hot rage, a deep, hollow grief, and finally a chillingly clear sense of purpose. They thought I was a pushover. They thought I was the quiet, responsible son who would just accept his lot and suffer in silence. They had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. My responsible nature wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. I was methodical, I was organized, and I was thorough. And I was about to turn all of those qualities toward dismantling the web of lies they had so carefully constructed. My first step was to find professional help. I couldn't confront them on my own. This wasn't a simple family argument anymore. It was a legal and financial matter involving breach of fiduciary duty and theft. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could guide me through the labyrinth of trusts and estates. I spent hours researching, looking for a financial advisor or an estate lawyer who specialized in trust disputes. I found a local firm with excellent reviews and made an appointment with a man named David Chen. Walking into his office felt like crossing a threshold. On one side was my old life, the one where I trusted my family. On the other was this new, uncertain reality. Mr. Chen was a sharp, focused man in his late 30s. He listened patiently as I laid out the whole story, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I told him about the family dynamic, my diagnosis, my plea for help, their rejection, and finally the invoice. I pushed the document across his polished desk. He picked it up, his expression unreadable as he scanned the page. He read it once, then a second time, his focus lingering on the line item detailing the source of funds. When he finally looked up, his eyes were serious. "This is a serious accusation, Eric," he said, his tone even. "But if this document is authentic, your parents as trustees have committed a grave breach of their fiduciary duty. A trust fund for your benefit cannot be used for the legal defense of your brother. That is not just unethical, it is illegal." Hearing him confirm my suspicions was both terrifying and validating. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting, this was real. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The first step," he said, "is to gain full transparency. As a beneficiary of the trust, you have the right to a full accounting of its activity. We need to see every transaction, every withdrawal, every deposit from the moment your parents took control of it." He explained the process. We would draft a formal letter, sent from his office, demanding a complete financial accounting of the generational trust for the past 10 years. This would force my parents to produce official bank and brokerage statements. "They will likely be shocked to hear from a legal representative," Mr. Chen warned. "They may try to contact you to pressure you. You must not speak to them. All communication must go through me. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my mother's dismissive tone, my father's silent complicity, my brother's selfish plea. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I'm prepared." The letter was sent the next day. The fallout was immediate. My phone started blowing up with calls and texts from my mom. "Eric, what is this? Why are you sending lawyers after us?" Followed by, "This is a huge misunderstanding. Call me." And finally, "You are tearing this family apart." Each message was a little more frantic, a little more manipulative. I followed Mr. Chen's advice and ignored them all, though it felt like lifting a shield against a hailstorm. The silence from my end must have spooked them, because 2 weeks later, a thick package arrived at Mr. Chen's office. It was a decade's worth of financial statements for my trust fund. Mr. Chen and I sat in his conference room, the documents spread out across the table. We went through them page by page, line by line. What we found was far worse than I had imagined. The $50,000 payment to the law firm wasn't the first unauthorized withdrawal. It was just the biggest and most recent. There was a pattern of smaller withdrawals, stretching back for years, each one coinciding with one of Kyle's life crises. There was $5,000 withdrawn around the time he crashed his first car. $10,000 disappeared a few months after his crypto trading venture went bust. Another $15,000 was taken out in installments during the year he was between his failed businesses. It was a slow, systematic bleeding of my inheritance. They were using my trust fund as their personal slush fund to finance my brother's irresponsible lifestyle, all while presenting me with doctored or incomplete statements that showed steady, uninterrupted growth. The total amount they had siphoned off over the years, including the lawyer's retainer, was just over $120,000. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't a one-time panic to save Kyle from jail. This was a long-term, calculated deception. They had been stealing from me for a decade. "We have everything we need," Mr. Chen said, his voice grim. "They've provided us with all the evidence required to prove their misconduct. The next step is to decide what you want to do with it." He laid out my options. I could sue them for the stolen amount plus damages, I could have them removed as trustees, or I could use this leverage to negotiate a settlement. The path forward was clear in my mind. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking back what was mine. Armed with the undeniable proof of my family's decade-long deception, the rage and grief I'd been feeling began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't the hurt son anymore. I was a man who had been wronged and was now seeking restitution. My objective was no longer just about getting the money back. It was about severing, completely and irrevocably, the financial cords that my parents had used to manipulate and control me. They had used their position as trustees not to protect my future but to plunder it. That power had to be taken away from them. I met with Mr. Chen again to map out the strategy. He laid out the legal avenues but emphasized that the final decision was mine. We can take them to court, he explained. Given the evidence, we would almost certainly win. The judge would likely order them to pay back the full amount plus interest, and they would be publicly removed as trustees. It would be a definitive but very messy victory. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Or, he continued, we can use the threat of litigation as leverage to force a private settlement. This would be faster, quieter, and would give you more control over the outcome. I considered the options. The idea of dragging my own parents through a public court case was nauseating. As much as they had hurt me, a part of me recoiled from the idea of inflicting that kind of public humiliation on them. But I also knew they wouldn't respond to anything less than a show of absolute strength. They had proven that they would only do the right thing when they were left with no other choice. We decided on a two-pronged approach. Mr. Chen would draft a formal legal demand, but we would present it to them in a controlled, private setting first. It would give them one final chance to do the right thing without being dragged into court. The plan was meticulous. First, Mr. Chen would file an immediate petition with the court to freeze all assets of the trust. This would prevent my parents from moving or withdrawing any more money in a panic. It was a crucial first move to protect what was left. Second, he drafted the formal demand. It was a formidable document, detailing every unauthorized withdrawal, citing the specific laws they had broken regarding their fiduciary duties, and stating our non-negotiable terms. The terms were simple and brutal. 1. They were to immediately resign as trustees of my fund. 2. A new independent trustee appointed by me and approved by the court would be put in their place. 3. They were to repay the full stolen amount of $120,000 plus a calculated amount of interest for the lost growth within 90 days. The final amount we calculated came to just over $145,000. 4. They were to liquidate whatever assets necessary to pay the debt, including, if needed, taking out a second mortgage on their paid-off house. And 5. If they did not agree to these terms in full within 10 days, we would immediately file a civil suit and pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. There was no room for negotiation. There was no appeal to emotion. It was a business transaction, a collection of a debt. While Mr. Chen handled the legal preparations, I did something for myself. I used the small amount of money I had left to book an appointment with the specialist I had been forced to put off. I paid for my medication. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that my well-being was no longer going to be put on hold. I was taking control of my health, just as I was taking control of my finances. The day we sent the demand, I felt a strange sense of calm. The ball was in their court. I had done everything I could. All the anger, the hurt, the frantic energy of the past few months had been channeled into a clear, decisive plan. Now all I could do was wait. The 10-day deadline we gave them was a countdown timer on my old life. Every day that passed without a response, I felt myself detaching a little more from the son I used to be. I was no longer Eric, the responsible one who would do anything for his family. I was Eric, a man who was cleaning up a mess he didn't create. The response came on the 9th day. It wasn't a call from my parents. It was a call from a lawyer they had hired. He was blustery and condescending, attempting to frame the withdrawals as informal family loans and accusing me of being ungrateful and vindictive. Mr. Chen handled the call with professional indifference. He simply stated that the terms were non-negotiable and that the 10-day deadline was firm. Any further discussion of family loans could be had in a courtroom in front of a judge. The lawyer's tone changed. The bluster faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance. They knew they were caught. The evidence was irrefutable. They had no defense. Later that day, their lawyer called back to inform Mr. Chen that my parents agreed to all the terms. They would sign the papers. They would pay the money. It wasn't a victory that brought me joy. There was no triumphant feeling, no sense of satisfaction in having beaten them. There was only a profound, aching sadness. The family I thought I had was gone forever, and I was the one who had to sign the death certificate. But beneath the sadness, there was also a sliver of something else, relief. The ties were being cut. The financial abuse was over. The next step was the final, painful confrontation where they would have to look me in the eye and sign away the control they had so viciously misused. The family meeting, as my parents' lawyer insisted on calling it, was arranged to take place at Mr. Chen's office. It was neutral territory. The purpose was singular: to sign the settlement documents. It was not a time for apologies, arguments, or emotional appeals. It was the formal execution of my plan. I arrived early with Mr. Chen. We sat in the sterile conference room, the stack of papers arranged neatly in the center of the large mahogany table. Each page was a testament to their betrayal and my resolve. When they arrived, the change in them was startling. My father, Mark, who had always been a quiet but steady presence, looked gray and diminished. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother, Helen, the orchestrator of the whole affair, seemed to have aged a decade. Her face was a mask of strained resentment. And Kyle was there too, which I hadn't expected. He stood behind our parents, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a guilty teenager. He was the reason we were all here, yet he looked like a mere spectator at his own disaster. They sat opposite me, their lawyer beside them. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the quiet rustling of papers as Mr. Chen began. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm and professional. "We are here today to finalize the agreement regarding the Generational Trust. The documents before you outline the terms that have been agreed upon by both parties." He proceeded to walk them through the key points, his language stripped of all emotion, the immediate resignation as trustees. The appointment of a new independent fiduciary, the repayment schedule for the full $145,000. As he spoke, I watched my mother's expression harden. When he finished, she couldn't contain herself. "Eric, how could you do this to us?" she began, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "We are your family. Everything we did for your brother. We were trying to keep him out of jail." Before I could respond, Mr. Chen held up a hand. "Helen," he said, using her first name with a deliberate lack of warmth, "this meeting is not for debating the past. The facts are established and the terms have been accepted. We are here to sign." Her lawyer murmured something to her and she fell silent, her glare fixed on me. It was then that I decided to speak. I hadn't planned to, but I couldn't let her version of reality hang in the air. "You weren't just helping Kyle," I said, my voice low and steady, my eyes locked on hers. "You were stealing from me to do it. You have been stealing from me for 10 years. I turned my gaze to my father. "You stood by and let it happen. You looked me in the eye and lied to my face about being broke while you were spending my inheritance." Finally, I looked at Kyle. "And you knew you were a part of it. You called me, asking me to lie for you, knowing they were using my money to clean up your mess." Kyle flinched, looking down at the table. My father just seemed to shrink further into his chair, but my mother's eyes blazed. "He is your brother. He needed help. You've always been so fortunate, so stable. You didn't need that money right now." "Kyle did. I needed it for my medical bills," I shot back, the words sharp as glass. "I came to you desperate and you told me to start a fundraiser online. You told me you were broke because you had already given $50,000 of my money to Kyle's lawyer. That wasn't a choice between your two sons. That was a choice to sacrifice one for the other, and you made it without a moment's hesitation." The truth, spoken so plainly in that quiet room, seemed to suck all the air out. There was nothing more they could say. Their justifications, their narrative of family loyalty, crumbled under the simple, brutal facts. They had been caught. Their lawyer cleared his throat, pushing the documents and a pen toward them. "Mark, Helen, it's time to sign." My father picked up the pen with a shaking hand. He signed each page without looking up. Then he pushed it toward my mother. She stared at the paper for a long moment, her jaw tight. I could see the battle raging within her, the denial, the fury, the humiliation. Finally, with a sharp, angry motion, she scribbled her signature. It was done. They stood up to leave, the meeting concluded. As they walked toward the door, my father paused and turned. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound and pathetic sorrow, before turning and following my mother out of the room. Kyle was the last to leave. He stopped in front of me, his usual charm completely gone, replaced by a raw, unfamiliar shame. "Eric, I'm sorry," he mumbled. I never thought it would go this far." "But it did, Kyle," I replied, my voice devoid of pity. "It did, and you let it." He nodded, then walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with my lawyer and the signed confession of my family's betrayal. It was the end of a chapter. The financial ties were legally severed. The balance sheet had been presented and the debt was now officially on the books. The aftermath of that final meeting was not cinematic. There was no dramatic music, no single moment of catharsis. Instead, there was a quiet, pervasive sense of finality. Life simply moved on, but the landscape of my world had fundamentally changed. The first payment from my parents arrived exactly 30 days later, as stipulated in the agreement. It was a cashier's check for a third of the total amount. Mr. Chen confirmed its deposit into a new trust account, one managed by a court-appointed professional and to which I had full transparency. Seeing that money, my money, returned to its rightful place was the first tangible proof that I had made the right decision. It wasn't about the cash itself. It was about the restoration of order, the correction of a deep and personal injustice. I used a portion of the first payment to fully cover my medical expenses for the next 2 years. The relief was immeasurable. For the first time since my diagnosis, I could focus on my health without the crushing weight of financial anxiety. I could see my specialist, afford my medications, and invest in things like physical therapy that I couldn't have dreamed of before. My health began to improve almost immediately. The physical symptoms eased as the mental stress that had been aggravating them disappeared. It was a powerful lesson. My well-being was my own responsibility. Ty and I finally had the resources to prioritize it. The subsequent payments arrived on schedule without drama or delay. I learned through the grapevine that my parents had to take out a large home equity loan to cover the debt. The paid-off house that had been their pride and joy now carried a lien, a permanent financial scar representing their betrayal. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a distant, clinical sense of consequence. Actions have results, and they were now living with the results of theirs. My relationship with them was, for all intents and purposes, over. We did not speak. There were no birthday cards, no holiday calls. The silence was absolute. I knew that in their minds, and likely in the stories they told to friends and extended family, I was the villain. I was the cold, unforgiving son who sued his own parents. I had to make peace with that narrative. I knew the truth. I knew that I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply exposed the fact that it was already broken. The person I heard from, surprisingly, was Kyle. About 6 months after the signing, he sent me a long, rambling email. He told me he'd hit rock bottom after the legal battle. Facing jail time without the safety net of my stolen inheritance had been a wake-up call. He had pleaded guilty, served a short sentence of weekend jail for a few months, and was now in a court-mandated sobriety program. He was working a steady, unglamorous job at a warehouse and paying his own rent for the first time in his life. He apologized again, more sincerely this time. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just seemed to want me to know that he was finally, painfully growing up. I wrote back a short, simple reply: "I wish you well, Kyle." It was all I could offer, and for now it was enough. With the financial chaos behind me, my life began to blossom in ways I hadn't expected. My freelance design business thrived. Free from the constant stress and able to focus fully on my creativity, I produced the best work of my career. I landed 2 major clients, which allowed me to build up my personal savings, separate from the trust, and start investing for my own future on my own terms. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted away from during my health crisis. I built a new kind of family, a chosen family of people who offered support without obligation, who celebrated my successes and listened when I was struggling. It was a healthier, more honest ecosystem than the one I had been born into. A year after the settlement, the final payment from my parents cleared. The debt was paid, the trust was whole again. On that day, I took a walk through the park near my apartment. The sun was out, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt genuinely light. I hadn't just reclaimed my money, I had reclaimed my life. I learned that a safety net you don't control isn't a safety net at all, it's a cage, and I had finally found the key. The future was no longer a legacy defined by my grandparents or mismanaged by my parents. It was a blank canvas, and I held the brush. I was building it myself on my own terms.